Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the new-ish Primary Arms SLX 1-10 LPVO. But before we get into the video, if you'd like to help me out personally, you can, of course, like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and does help us out quite a bit. On top of that, there's Subscribestar, which is basically just a pro to a Patreon. There's also my website, which really doesn't have much in stock right now. Now, getting into full disclosure on the Primary Arms SLX 1-10x28 LPVO. I do have a relationship with Primary Arms. They do send me optics to review for free. I think that box right there is the new 1-6 Classic series, so a very, very entry-level scope. However, this optic I did pay my own money for when it came out a couple months ago. I did pay a reduced price for it through their dealer program, but again, I paid my own money for it, but I'm also have a relationship with Primary Arms, so just keep that in mind. Now, getting into specifics on the SLX 1-10, this is, of course, a second focal plane LPVO. Now, I know that will be a big turnoff to some people. When you have a 1-10, that's a second focal plane versus a first focal plane. Personally, it still doesn't matter too much to me, depending on what I have it on. Most of the time, inside 300 yards, you don't need first focal plane because you're just using that center chevron in this case, and then maybe a little bit underneath it. And then if you're beyond 300 yards, you're probably at max magnification. But there are some circumstances where you might be at any of those, intermediate magnification levels, because of course you do have a 1-10 range, where that first focal plane would help you out. So again, it's a minor issue, but it's depending on how you use it, depending on who you are, what your thoughts are on first focal plane, it might be a complete deal breaker, or like in my case, it matters, but not all that much. Now, this is a 1-10x28, meaning that we have a 34mm main tube, meaning that you get hopefully a little bit better light collecting ability, so you get a little bit overall better image, clarity, brightness, that sort of stuff. It also means that you get a little bit more forgiving exit pupil, which you're going to need when you have such a high-end magnification on an LPVO, of course, at 10x. Now, this is a one-piece aluminum body, 6061. It is hard coat anodized in this very nice black anodization. Now, talking about size and weight for just a minute, this is actually a fairly trim scope for being a 1-10 LPVO 34mm main tube, coming in at about 10.5 inches long, which is standard, but the weight is just over 19 ounces. So in this 34mm Aero Precision mount, where they're ultralight mounts, I think the total package is like 23 ounces, which again, for a 1-10x LPVO with mount is fairly low. So as far as size and weight goes, even though it is a 1-10 with a 34mm main tube, it's actually pretty good. Not the lightest LPVO out there, but pretty good. Now, getting into the external features of the optic, we of course have capped, windage, and elevation knobs. Now, the caps themselves are very nicely knurled, very nicely machined. This one here actually sustained a lot of damage, but still works. Very interestingly, the increments on the dials themselves are half MOA, even though this is a mil-based scope with a mil-grid reticle. However, with this style of optic, you are very much so going to be setting it and forgetting it. So other than zeroing the gun, you're really not going to be using the turrets. Now, on the windage dial, or on the windage cap, you actually have a space on the inside for an additional 2032 battery, which is very nice. That means that if your battery dies and you need illumination for whatever reason, you at least have a spare built into the optic. Now, getting into the illumination settings themselves, you of course have an off, and then you go into two night vision settings. Now, night vision settings on any LPVO, especially a more budget LPVO, are a bit optimistic, though there are probably a couple people out there somewhere who might use them. Now, the rest of them are daylight settings, or kind of your mid-range settings, and the top two, 10 and 11, are labeled DT1 and DT2, which is going to be like daytime 1 and 2. It's not quite as bright as you would assume if they have an actual daytime setting. However, it does get at least comparably bright to other budget LPVOs, meaning that it is decent at max illumination, though your battery life is very short. I accidentally left it on DT2 for like a couple days and the battery died. So again, I'm not sure what the actual battery life is, just know that it's not very good. Fortunately, it had a backup battery in the optic itself. Now, while it is nice to have a couple labeled daytime settings, again, on this one, unfortunately, they're not really particularly brighter than other non-fiber optic illumination on other scopes that you can get. Now, moving back from there, the last thing we need to talk about is your magnification ring, which is a very smooth throw from 1-10x magnification. It is a 180-degree throw, which is standard. The machining on it is very nice. It has very aggressive knurling on it. It also comes with an included throw lever that is adjustable. So they actually have a couple different models. They have shorter ones, they have longer ones. So again, if there's something that just really suits your fancy, you can switch that out. Very importantly, it does come with them, or at least comes with one, so that you at least have something out of the box. You don't have to spend more money to get a feature that should be included. Last thing on the scope itself is going to be the adapter at the rear for adjusting the reticle to your eyes. Usually I leave it all the way in for my specific set of eyes, but everybody is going to be a little bit different. Now, getting into the actual usability of the scope, that is going to be your eye box, your eye relief, and your field of view. Like most LPVOs at 1x, you get a very forgiving eye box and eye relief. Anywhere from 2 to 7 inches, you're getting a usable eye relief, a usable image through the scope. And then at the appropriate distance between 3 and 3.5, 4 inches behind the optic, you get about a ½ inch up, down, left, and right, where you get a very usable image. So hopefully you'll be seeing some of the footage that I'm rolling in from not necessarily odd positions, but more disadvantageous positions for using a rifle scope. And it's still very easy to get a good sight picture, even at medium magnification settings, somewhere between 3 and 6, and still make shots quickly and hit your targets. So overall, the eye box, eye relief at low to medium magnification levels is good to very good, and when it gets up to the higher end of magnification levels, that's where it gets very, very tight. Like most things at 10x, not only does the eye relief itself tighten up greatly, to where maybe you only have 1 inch forward and back, but your left and right is now very, very tight. So anytime you're at 7, 8, 9, 10x magnification, you need to be directly behind it and preferably in a very stable location. Now, while it is of course still very usable, there are going to be certain areas where it's going to be less advantageous to be at those higher magnification levels, just because it does get very tight and much more constricting in terms of how you can use it. It's going to be much more forgiving anywhere from 1 to 4, and then as you kind of get above that, it starts to tighten up quite a bit. So a lot of the times when it comes to what should I buy, a 1 to 6, a 1 to 8, a 1 to 10, it really depends on, do you actually need the 8x or 10x magnification? If you don't need those magnifications, oftentimes you're making sacrifices that you don't need to if you had just gone with the 1 to 6 or the 1 to 8 models. Now, this 1 to 10, again, it's not bad, but you are definitely going to be making some sacrifices in terms of usability to get that higher end of magnification. Now, field of view, if I haven't mentioned it already, at 1x is 110 feet. Which is very good. If you don't know my scale, anything above 100 is good, 110, very good, and then 120 is basically your top tier phenomenal area. 110 on a 1 to 10x LPVO on 1x is very good, and that's going to translate all the way through the magnification range, so that as you increase the magnification, if it starts out at a very good point, usually it'll end up at a very good point as well. So overall, the field of view is very good, really nothing to complain about. Now, moving on to what is almost certainly the most important aspect of the scope, and that is going to be the reticle. Now, I believe they have a couple different models of this 1-10x28. This one specifically is the Griffin M10s reticle, which is going to be very similar to other reticles that I've reviewed from Primary Arms in the past, specifically the ACSS Griffin mill. Now, this one here is going to be based around a 1x1 mil grid. They also have a BDC version of the reticle, which is much simpler, and if you're marrying it to a 5.56 16-inch gun, 14.5-inch gun, using that specific ammo type, that's going to work great. However, what I like about mil grids in general is I can throw them on odd guns, like a 10.5-inch 7.62x39, and I can plug that data into a ballistic calculator and get a good solution based on that mil grid, rather than kind of holdovers with a BDC that I'm attempting to make work with a odd barrel length, caliber, ammunition, so on and so forth. So getting right into the reticle, starting off in the center section, we of course have our chevron. Now, very importantly, this chevron is fairly diminutive, meaning that it does not obscure a lot of your targets. Even smaller targets at extended distances still look very good using this center chevron. So it's a good blend of being very precise while still being quick enough to acquire up close, especially with that very thick outer horseshoe. Now, moving down from there, we get into our 1x1 mil grid. 1x1 mil grids are very good out to about 700 yards or so. Now, if you're shooting at very small targets, you might have some issues because you'll have to do kind of a bracketing between mil dots versus like a 1/2x1/2 mil grid or like a 2x2 MOA grid or other optics out there that are a little bit more precise. However, again, for the intended application of an LPVO, 1x1 mil grids is going to be precise enough for 95% of applications out there. Now, on top of that, this is, of course, an ACSS reticle, so you have your auto ranging in the actual mill grid itself. On top of that, you have holdovers for moving targets. You have your auto ranging on the left and right side. So again, there are a lot of features built into the reticle. Now, the mill grid Christmas tree itself in the Griffin M10s goes all the way out to 15 mils, which, depending on your caliber and barrel length, is about 1,000 yards plus. So again, just about any scenario where you'd want to deploy a 1-10 LPVO, the reticle has you covered in terms of both the mill grid, the auto ranging features, the quick acquisition up close. It is a very, very versatile rifle scope reticle. That is, the one area where it's going to be held back a little bit for some people is the fact that it is second focal plane, meaning that you always need to be at 10x magnification if you want to use that mill grid. So again, if it was first focal plane, you could be at any of those intermediate magnifications and still use the mill grid. If you're trying to take an extended range shot and using the mill grid, like say 400, 500, 600 yards, the odds are you're already going to be at 10x magnification anyways. But again, there are certain circumstances where it is going to be a downside having a second focal plane versus a first focal plane reticle. Now, getting into durability and the drop testing on the 1-10x28, I've used this optic for a couple months now. I've used it on a lot of different guns. I used it on the CAC 13-9, the DD15, Davidson Defense DD15. I've used it on this 10.5-inch 7.62x39 for about 500 rounds, and this was actually the gun that I took out to 500 yards with the mill grid reticle. So that was the distance shooting that I did with this optic. In terms of just normal firing, perfect, no issues whatsoever. We do, however, do a double drop test on this channel on just about every optic that we test. So the first drop is going to be on dirt and rocks, and the second drop is going to be almost a pass-fail on an AR-500 steel plate. So now, this is again a 10.5-inch 7.62x39 heavy barrel from Bear Creek Arsenal is the barrel itself. The bolt itself is from Young Manufacturing. I'm doing some testing on that, and it still held up incredibly well, even at an extended round count. So starting out, we of course do a 5-round control group at 50 yards. That way there we can see how the zero is shifting after each drop. Now, the first group that I fired was excellent, coming in at right at 1 MOA, because again, this barrel is a very heavy barrel, and it is very accurate, even with cheap ammunition. Then we did a shoulder height drop, and the group opened up quite a bit, and I was not really happy with that. So I went ahead and shot a second 5-round group after the shoulder height drop onto dirt and rocks, and got a much better group. However, it did shift about an inch to the right or so, so it's about a 2 MOA shift. That's not terrible, but again, we would like to see that at 0. Then we went ahead and did another shoulder height drop onto the AR-500 steel plate, shot another 5-round group, and it moved to the left about 2 inches, which is about 4 MOA. Now, it did pass the shoulder height drop onto the AR-500 steel target, which is kind of, again, almost like a pass-fail test. Most optics die at that point or have an extreme shift in zero. Only seeing about 2 MOA, 2 to 4 MOA shift in zero after a shoulder height drop onto an AR-500 steel target is pretty good. Again, not perfect, not what we'd like to see, but overall, for being a 1-10 LPVO, it does appear that it's going to experience some shift in zero after a harsh impact. Not the end of the world, but it is definitely something that you should be cognizant of and keep in the back of your mind. Now, the durability itself, in terms of not dying, is actually pretty darn good. Now, again, keep in mind that every drop that I do is anecdotal to that specific optic on that specific gun on that specific day, and it's not really going to translate to your specific circumstance, but just keep in mind that, again, if your optic experiences a sharp impact, most likely there will be a small shift in zero. So now, with all of that out of the way, what do I actually think of the optic, and do I think that it's a good value? Now, this optic is kind of in that high budget range. It's not really what I would consider to be mid-range, like that $600 to $900, and it's not really a high-end scope either, of course, but it's also not super cheap. Now, the main questions that you need to ask yourself is, 1, do you need 1 to 10x magnification? And 2, are you fine with that reticle in a second focal plane option? Now, the reticle itself is great. I have almost no complaints about that whatsoever. the main thing is going to be, can you live with that at 10x magnification only in terms of its true usability? Now, actually using the optic at 1x, it does all of the normal LPVO things. The 1x performance is fine. It's not the flattest, not the best image out there. The glass quality is going to be on par with your other Chinese optics. And when it comes to speed and usability, especially at those low to mid-range magnification settings, it does work very well. The 1x is decent. The reticle does work well for picking it up quickly. So if you do need to use it quickly, it is very usable for giving, again, at those lower magnification settings. The big downside is going to be when you get into the higher magnification settings, it becomes less usable, more restrictive. Though the reticle is very good, it is a second focal plane reticle. So this is not a perfect optic that I would go out there and recommend to everyone. It's not really even a general purpose optic because, again, it does have that 10x magnification. Most of the time, most people would probably be served better with a 1-6 or a 1-8, maybe a little bit smaller, lighter, more forgiving, that sort of stuff. But if you're looking for 10x magnification, sub $500 with a very good reticle, then this does fulfill that. Again, you just have to ask yourself if you're willing to live with some of the downsides. Overall, I do think that it is a very good value. It's one of the only 2 or 3 scopes that is a 1-10 34mm main tube in this price range, and it almost undoubtedly has the best reticle. And again, if those specs are something that you need, something that you have a purpose for, you have a gun that would make a lot of sense with a 1-10x mil grid on top of it, well, then it is certainly a high value option, something that works, something that I personally trust. The durability is good. The reticle is very good. Usability, again, ranges from very good to pretty tight on the higher end magnifications. It's not a perfect optic, a lot of downsides, but again, for certain people on a budget looking for that high end magnification, looking for that reticle specifically, because again, the reticle is very good, it can make sense. So let me know what you guys think of the Primary Arms SLX 1-10x28. This is, of course, the Griffin M10s reticle version. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments down below. If there's any other 1-10x's that I should compare it against, or if there's anything else that you guys want to see from me. So with all that out of the way, guys, hope you guys have a wonderful day. I think this is going up on Christmas Eve, so if I don't see you tomorrow, Merry Christmas. Peace out.